I've talked about this before on on the immortal account of Jeremiah Zip. But the question is, do you grate your sporp or do you leave it liming?
Leave
That's
it limey, obviously.
yeah.
Limey.
So we've got two on team limey. Anybody else? Do you grate your sporp or leave it limey?
I'm going to
do people
leave
not
it
know how
because
to
I
rip a
don't know
bit?
what
Come
it
on.
is. So
I
I assume that I left it
Jesus
alone
Christ.
because I didn't know what it was.
Hody is
You
taking
guys have never done improv theater, I can tell.
I
Hody.
just like cheese.
Hody. Well,
Yeah.
it's sporp. It's a very specific substance. Hody is doing the school of thought of like you find something weird in the woods, and then you leave it like that because you don't know why that's there. You don't know if it's a hex. You don't it's somebody's religious symbol. It's weird. You're leaving it in the woods.
But you know what you need to do? You need to get better at Unity and hit up the amprims. Be like, hey, Zerzan, what's this? Be like, don't
Maybe it likes
Hey, what on the
cheese.
cell phone?
Is sport the thing they tell you about if you haven't had a circumcision? Is that what that is?
No, that's smegma.
That's a different type of cheese you do not
Yeah.
want to consume.
That was
You know what?
legit,
I'm
yeah.
going to email John Zerzan after this podcast. and get him back.
That
This
one's
should be
harder
fun.
to grate though because like that one's more like spongy, fluidic. So you wouldn't want you wouldn't want to grate that one anyway. That one answers itself. That's like trying to grate cottage cheese.
Now I'm hungry.
This is
All right.
This is a great introduction to our
Yeah.
stream talking about
Just
anarchist class.
normal, honestly.
So we're talking about class war today because a thing came up in a Facebook group chat. And that thing led to a conversation, which led to a conversation about a potential conversation, and now we're having that conversation. So, yeah. See, and the thing is, I don't even write this stuff down. I'm just very good at saying nonsense for like deadpan delivery. But anyway, so we'll start off before we get into any of this by me describing why my voice might sound extra shit today. I screamed fuck a lot right before the chat because I accidentally streamed some bigoted bullshit to my Twitch that I meant to be recording. So y'all who followed me on Twitch, you got to see a heads up on some other content I will be doing relatively soon.
I'm gonna say, isn't screaming fuck kind of part of your daily routine?
Yeah, but I
Scream at the
normally
computer.
I normally don't scream it like that. Like I the last time I really screamed fuck like that, it was when I dropped a weight rack on my phone, and it looks like this now, because
no.
like the bottom bolt that was on the bottom of this squat rack just sort of, so that wasn't good, and like I have it. That it's not to say that like I don't have another phone now. Although this one is from Korea, not just like the Samsung brand Korea thing, but like from Korea, so it has a bunch of weird shit. Like, apparently if I take this into Korea, or like I think actually any East Asian country, like there will be a geosensor in this that turns on and will mandate that a camera shutter sound happens if I take a picture. And this is apparently because a bunch of fucking perverts were taking upskirt and weird restroom stall and other sorts of shots with their phones, and so they made a law that you had to have your phone signal on, otherwise, like, they could take these shots and not be seen. And so now I can't go to Japan and take my perv shots, which is good because I wouldn't have done that. But it also means that if you like try to record video for some sort of public accountability, it has to have that little boop sound or whatever. So I have a Korean phone. It also has weird Korean shit on it. I don't know. It's not what I would have preferred. Also, it's a Drake phone because it's black on the outside, and let's just say anyway.
Wow. Hey, Jeremiah, Logan Paul wants to know if he can go to Japan with you and hang out in the forest.
Yeah, right. Well, speaking of like
What a beginning, jeez.
exactly. You know, we gotta be timely with these
about the
references.
success theory thing.
Yeah, right. Okay, the first thing I'll say, I want everybody to introduce. Some people, it's been a bit. Some people, it's been less of a bit. Some people, it's been a lot of bits and a bowl full of milk. So let's start with John. We'll go Bigfoot. We'll go Kareem, Keith, Rose, and Hody.
I'm John Ponte. I'm a writer for Liberty Centuries. We've been reporting on some stuff in regards to Libertarian Party shenanigans when it comes to both the national, and we have an article coming out soon, or well, not soon. I don't know if it's soon, but coming out in regards to certain affiliate shenanigans. As for political position that's corresponding with this discussion, I would call myself an anarchist, specifically of the socialist kind, sort of between Kropotkin and Proudhon.
All right, Bigfoot.
I am the anarchist Bigfoot. I'm a cryptid that lives in the woods that has an unhealthy obsession with historical political movements, philosophy, and a healthy obsession with anarchy. And my position in this discussion will be one coming from the French class theory as pioneered by J.B. Say, Charles Comte, and Charles Dunoyer. Specifically focused on the relationship of the individuals who control and participate in the state apparatus versus everyone else in the population as a form of class theory. That's all I got. We can't hear you, Jeremiah.
He went to hang out with Logan Paul. He got arrested.
Oh my God. Hody, let's go with you, and then we'll go Keith.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Hody Johns. I'm with the Love First Christians. As far as class warfare goes, I have strict commands in the scriptures about warfare, as well as strict commands about how we honor people of different classes. So there's a lot of cool stuff there. Also be adding a little book into this discussion because I think it's valid, even though I am very aware, before all of you scream it at me, that he was not a Christian. Those of you who have read him talking about communalism actually are probably all too well aware that he was heavily influenced by Christian ideas. So I guess that's where I'm coming from.
I bumped my mic cable, and my mic cable is related to a system that is literally like nearly a decade old now, maybe a little over, so that's why the shit fucked up. Kareem, then Keith, then Rose.
Okay. So, I'm Kareem. You can find me on Twitter, 6633, Anarch Unity. Check out Attack the System with Keith. I'm sure I'll announce that. And Mad Liberty. And you can put your feet in the fridge and take a picture. To verify yourself. And I started this discussion, I think, because I posted a meme that I got off a Luigi Mangione page that had a cop that said class traitorade, and I thought it was funny. And then I started showing it to my friends, and they started laughing. So I'm like, hey, yeah, this is pretty cool. And recently I've been watching It Has to Be Said, which I will get him on either this show or my show.
Had to be said.
Had to be said. Chris. The big thing he brought up was like ANCAPs of good economic analysis. You could even say even better in some cases than counterparts on the left with the Austrian school. The problem is there's some issues with class analysis, and they come off like, I guess you could say like the conservatives, like egalitarianism is bad because everybody, can't be equal, but that's not what they mean. And also they have the problem, I would say, of like, well, everybody is rich. Everybody can be rich. And you're rich because you have a smartphone, or you're rich because you have, enough to eat or something like that, where the problem is they want to say capitalism is good and corporatism is bad. And I think that you can make some reasonable argument with Conkin's, like, okay, I have a lemonade stand versus a multinational corporation. But the problem is Kevin Carson, who's in the chat, made the point to Larkin. Well, half of these people have the capitalist business with the slave trade, then their grandfather and uncle just reinvested it. By the time you get to modern days, it's like my family's all dentists and lawyers,
Well,
and I get to have unlimited time. Then yes, you can invent Facebook, Snapchat, whatever,
Right.
Microsoft. But if your parents are not well off and you're on a factory floor, how are you going to invent,
right.
whatever it is?
We'll get
That's
into
it.
more of the meat of this also shortly. So, like, after introductions. So, Keith, and then Rose.
Well, my name is Keith Preston. Some of you may know me as Troy Preston. I go by Troy on Facebook because Keith Preston was sent to Facebook electric chair. I am the chief editor of a website called attackthesystem.com. It's sort of a multi-purpose political and cultural website with an underlying anarchist theme. I've been the main editor of that for, I think, 24 years, so about as long as there's been the internet. But I'm also, I've written about half a dozen books. If you Google my name, Keith Preston, you can find all kinds of stuff about me or by me, or including what critics think and what I guess fans think or whatever. And let's see, I first became interested in libertarianism probably around 1980 when I heard about the Libertarian Party and its presidential candidate that year. And I didn't really give much more thought to it until probably a few years later when I heard of William Godwin, the anarchist. And I realized, wow, there is such a people as anarchists. And then by the late 80s, I started to fully identify as an anarchist. Yeah, that's one of my books there that Kareem is holding up. So I started to identify as an anarchist in the mid to late 80s. And early on, I was sort of like a Noam Chomsky type of anarchist. I used to belong to the IWW. I used to belong to the U.S. section of the IWA, which was the old Anarchist Syndicalist International that the Spanish CNT was a part of. And then over time, I started becoming interested in more and more types of anarchism and other types of philosophies. I have a point of view that I call anarcho-pluralism, which isn't a term that's original to me. I originally picked it up from an old anarcho-syndicalist back in the 80s. He was already in his 90s at the time. He was a veteran of classical anarchism, like back in the 1910s, 1920s. But I use the term fairly broadly. It's just sort of an umbrella term or sort of a meta paradigm for all different types of anti-authoritarianism, anarchism, libertarianism, decentralism, anti-statism, all these different kinds of ideas. So I'm mostly interested in meta politics. And since our theme here is class theory, I use the terms state, ruling class, power elite, and empire sometimes interchangeably, but I actually think they have different meanings, and I can get into that a little bit if others want.
Rose.
And I'm Rose, patron saint of real libertarians. I'm sure you've seen me by now, active member of the Libertarian Party of New York. We recently started up our own podcast. It's called The Liberty Test. You can find that on the Libertarian Party of New York YouTube channel. And so class theory is something that a lot of libertarians tend to screw up because they think that it's only something that Marxists care about. So in actuality, there is absolutely an exploiting class and an exploited class, and it's a good idea to understand which one you're part of and to have class analysis. So that's what we're here for.
Yeah, so like just a brief explainer on my position. I'm very much of the position that the state is more than just the people who identify as government. That the state itself is, and not just affiliated with, right, is anybody who assists the state. And that because of that, like, I think that a cohesive sort of analysis can broadly accept like anarchists from all across that bottom strip, as long as they're willing to accept that like they've got synergy with one another in the people with whom they are at war. Now, I like the idea of class war, and I liked that image by that Kareem posted of calling a cop a class traitor, because to me, from my perspective, the system itself has designed itself around like preserving the state's interests and being sort of an agent or actor within the state. And I want to throw a bone to the right before I just completely tear into them, because I can almost guarantee that that's how this is going to end up, because I'm kind of an asshole. But like the general gist of it is that if you like work with these people, you are not just working with the state, you are working as an agent of the state. And like the bone that I can throw to the right is I routinely post this quote: if we are to keep the term capitalism at all, then we must distinguish between free market capitalism on one hand and state capitalism on the other. And going down a little bit further, throughout history, states have existed as instruments for organized predation and exploitation. It doesn't much matter which group of people happen to gain control of the state at any given time, whether it be Oriental despots, kings, landlords, privileged merchants, army officers, or communist parties. The result is everywhere and always the coercive mulcting of the mass of producers, in most centuries, of course, largely the peasantry, by a ruling class of dominant rulers and their higher professional bureaucracy. So, that's Murray Rothbard. He's, not a leftist, noted non-leftist, and he is very much on board with the idea, at least in that particular instance, maybe not later on in his career when he got senile and stupid. The, general gist of it is that, the sort of even right-wing analysis of this acknowledges, at least from a libertarian position, that there is a ruling class, and that ruling class is comprised of the people who rule and who maintain the rulership structure. So for me, I feel like that mentality synergizes what probably everybody here feels, including Bigfoot, who had the biggest sort of rub with the idea of classes and class traders. And I'll pass it to him after I just finish by saying that because of the relationship between the state and capital, and because of the sort of things that Kareem was bringing up, it's the same, it's the same thing as like Killer Mike in his song about Reagan saying, "If none of us own acres, then none of us grow wheat." I gotta move you back down, Kareem. We can't be sharing the screen right now.
Okay.
Once it's your turn, we can definitely once it's passed to you, we can definitely talk about sharing screens. But the general gist of it is that if none of us own acres, then none of us grow wheat, right? It's that mentality of if we don't own the means of production, then we aren't the people who actually control our futures, control our sort of position in society. And it's that mentality. It's the same mentality of, the story of OJ. It's the same mentality of this, also Run the Jewels, just with the $ in that song title. Look at all these slave masters posing on your dollar. The economy itself is part of the state. The people who make the most are doing that because of their working with and being a part of the state. So to me, I think that synergizes well with what you were saying, and probably you're not going to find much friction. So let's start with Bigfoot, and we'll start with the general mentality that he was trying to express by trying to, I guess, make a distinction in this regard.
So, from my perspective, the one thing that I really take umbrage with when it comes to, I guess, the more mainstream form of class theory is the focus on specific economics as a means to power, as opposed to power being a means to economic wealth, which I feel like is historically and generally across the world the more common avenue. In my example, when we were having our discussion, was that they're, take Africa, for instance, where they're constantly having coups and, governments are being overthrown, that sort of thing. Generally, it's not a rich man who orchestrates the coup. It is a poor man, usually from the military, usually someone lower rank, who creates essentially a public movement based off of some, convincing words, and gets himself a large amount of people willing to take up arms in his name in order to overthrow their government. And then once he's installed, now he's the oppressive dictator that has the palatial mansion and, takes their 60 to 75% of the country's wealth for his own personal use, that sort of thing. You had a quote, Jeremy. I wanted to give my own quote, ironically from the same author, but from a different book. This is a summarization of my personal, I guess, what I subscribe to as far as class theory is concerned. Like I said earlier, it comes from Charles Dunayer, I'm probably butchering that name, and also Charles Comte. And the Comte-Dunayer view held the inherent class struggle to focus on which classes manage to gain control of the state apparatus. The ruling class is whichever group has managed to seize state power, and the ruled are those groups who are taxed and regulated by those in command. Class interest, then, is defined as a group's relation to the state. State rule, with its taxation and exertion of power, controls, and conferring of subsidies and privileges, is the instrument that creates conflicts between the rulers and the ruled. What we have then is a two-class theory of class conflict based on whether a group rules or is ruled by the state. On the free market, and I'm sorry, I'll cut that part out. That's just Rothbardism. He's going to throw some shade at every other form of market besides a free market. We don't need that part. But essentially, and you're absolutely right, Jeremy. Like I said before in the group chat, I agree with pretty much 90% of what you say, and probably 100% of what you just said. But my main rub is this hyperfixation on the idea that wealth is in itself a form of power, when in reality, wealth only works with willing people to take your money. If there's no one to hire, if there's nothing to buy, if there's no one to give your money to who will take it, then you have no power as a wealthy person unless you have actual physical objects you can use for yourself, which is real wealth. I feel like focusing on that, as opposed to focusing on the state apparatus, the state privileges, the fact that they got their wealth from illicit means, as opposed to the wealth itself, is it's not necessarily wrong, but I feel like it's going to lead to a problem in the future when we don't get rid of the apparatus that allowed for that wealth accumulation in the first place, and we instead target the wealth accumulation, leaving the apparatus alone, ready to be taken by someone else, if that makes any sense.
Rose seems like she has something she wants to jump in with.
I was going to say, because I feel like in order to develop a good model of class theory, we first need to define exploitation and develop a working model of exploitation theory. So because most people associate class theory with Marxism, like we can start with how Marxists draw their class distinctions. They draw their class distinctions in terms of relationship to the means of production. So they divide people into the working class and the owning class or capitalist class. And then from their perspective, because the value of a product is determined by the amount of socially necessary labor that goes into it, wage labor is inherently exploitative because of the extraction of surplus value, because the price of the finished good is sold for more than the amount of more than the employee is paid. So that's what leads to the primary class antagonisms. Like you have your owning class that's exploiting your working class because they own the means of production, which are protected by the state. And then you have the working class who are being exploited for their surplus value. This is not really adequate because time preference theory tells us that some people, time preference being the way people value the way people value future goods the value people assign to present goods over future goods tells us that some people will likely choose to work for a set wage as opposed to the full value of the product they're producing. So, for example, you have someone who's building widgets. They can, for example, either use their own money or borrow money to buy all the raw materials, build the widgets themselves, hope they can sell them, and then get the full value. Or if they don't want to go through all that risk and they don't want to wait to get the full value, they can get a job at the widget factory, get paid a set amount upfront, and then whether or not the widgets sell is kind of not their problem because they're getting paid a set wage. So clearly it's not just surplus value, and it's not just the employer-employee relationship that is at the heart of exploitation theory. So then, what is it? I personally tend to view exploitation in terms of manipulation of time preference, which kind of brings me to my point that I was trying to make. I'm of the belief that the ability to manipulate a person's time preference is what is that's the primary mechanism by which you're able to exploit people. And the way that this is done under our economic system is through control of the monetary supply. If you have a centralized state that has a monopoly on the money, and they're able to control the value and interest rates of the money, they can artificially manipulate the time preference of everyone else who is forced to use that particular currency. So if people are, they're forced to use this particular currency and then its value is always decreasing, they're going to be they're going to have to constantly value because if the value is constantly decreasing, they're going to have to borrow money and go into debt because they can't save. And they're also going to be perpetually desperate, and they're going to take whatever job that they are being offered. So this allows the politically connected class to get away with, for example, paying subpar wages and offering subpar benefits because you have a class of people who, rather than being able to negotiate higher wages or hold out until they find a well-paying job, they're going to take whatever job is offered to them because they've got bills to pay and they're always in debt. They've got debt to pay off. If that makes any sense.
It does.
Could I don't want to talk too much, but you just sparked my thinking machine there, Rose, and I want to offer a modification to your theory that you just said and see if this works. Maybe fits a little better for every case. What if instead of time preference being the manipulating aspect in order to create exploitation in a given situation, it is opportunity cost? And by that, I mean that instead of directly manipulating, like you can directly manipulate time preference through opportunity costs, but opportunity costs can be used to manipulate a group of people in a much more broad way and under a much, more broad structure. So, for example, not just time preference, but say you make it so that it is essentially impossible for someone to be able to afford, due to the opportunity cost of the decision, to act outside of your chosen behaviors that you want to encourage, thus forcing them to pick between two extremely dissatisfactory options. But because the opportunity cost that you've created via taxation, via regulation, via exploitation outright, via company towns, that sort of thing, you make it impossible for them to not choose one of your predetermined suitable options as the exploitator, thus giving you a market premium on their production, no matter what they want, because you manipulated the situation around them to force them to choose what you wanted. Does that sound like something that would work with where you're going?
I kind of feel like the two of those go hand in hand. Like, for example, opportunity costs. Like, okay, so say I have a particular skill and I'm having a hard time finding work, or I'm having a hard time making enough money off this skill. Like, I could go learn something else, but there's opportunity costs. Like, instead of, like, I'm going to have to forego making money for a set amount of time because now I have to go off and, like, for example, go back to school and borrow money to do that. Or even if I'm just teaching myself, like, during that time I'm learning this new skill, I'm not making money off of it. And I'm also not making money off of my old one. So if people are in a perpetual state of debt, they're going to be in a position where they're less likely to be able to do that.
So,
yeah.
So
Hmm.
real quick, and then I'm gonna pass this directly to Kareem, then Keith, then Hody, because they've, and like John, if he's got something he wants to say after Hody, and then so the primary thing, like, I always think about pedigree. I always think about like the history, the legacy of property, right? How the title has transferred down, how the title was initially procured, and what led to that procurement and the maintenance thereof throughout its like sort of pedigree. It's like the history of the property itself is what I'm talking about. While I belch, obviously, but the general gist of it is that like for instance, there's a reason black people were told that they would get 40 acres and a mule, and they didn't get that. And because they didn't get that, they were at a significant disadvantage as a demographic cluster for a significant period of time because they did not have the generational wealth or the economic wherewithal, the stability to start from the same sorts of grounds that a variety of like whites specifically did. And the same could be said for the First Nations peoples on their like reservations that are just absolute dog shit like treatment of them, like giving them the worst of the worst land that's like irradiated or poisoned or otherwise fucked, and then like yeah sure they gave that to them, but it's not like this let them compete in terms of the marketplace. Like so those sorts of things, or taking away the property of Japanese and other sorts of migrants here in the U.S. during the World War II because they were considered aliens, enemy and sedition, and blah 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 blah. And so like they didn't just put them in camps. They said we're taking your fucking store, bitch. And like that put them back to square one a lot of the time. The same can be said for the Jews in Nazi Germany or any of a variety of other minorities in Nazi Germany who were put back to square fucking one. So when I think about the pedigree of certain property, it's who got that property initially, how did that property get maintained, how did they continue to get that property transferred, what did the power structures look like as a result of the initial pedigree and the people who held that power, and would it look different if different people were parts of the owning class before before the present conditions took hold? And I think the answer is obviously yes. I think that the material conditions that are on the ground now are the result of the groundwork that was laid then. And I don't think that we can ignore the materialist conditions that were present then as a factor of like economic development into the present. And I think that like if we don't ignore that, that what we end up with is a framework that like acknowledges that property itself has been accrued by the state through its conquest, like Rothbard was saying in that paragraph, and that because of that, the state has been the people who have maintained that property in certain people's hands. And that's the reason why you can't use your property for certain things. And it's also the reason why they're allowed to take your property if you don't do exactly what they want. Because to them, you're just another person to conquer if you get in their way. So it's not a matter of power needing to feed economics exclusively. It's also a matter of those economics paying a brother back and giving that power back into the system that enabled it to begin with. It's a cycle, not a unidirectional, single-way flowing street. It's a cycle between the economics and the power of the situation, and then the power back to the economics. They power each other. It's not just a one-way thing. And to me, that's the rigorous analysis that's needed, because we have to figure out how to break that cycle and allow more people a seat at that table in order to diversify the power structure and eventually break it down. So I'll throw it to Kareem, then Keith, then Hody, then John if he wants, and then we'll get back to Bigfoot and Rose, and I want to like, I just did like 5 minutes. I want to say we'll try to keep responses to that to make sure that everybody has their amount of time. So Kareem, go for it.
Okay, yeah, I can do it in less than 5 minutes. So I do agree that it is manipulating time preference, but I don't think that's the underlying root. I think the root is actually, as Chomsky defined it, if you have a hierarchy or that is unjustified. Now, people like to say dumb things like, "Oh well, what do we do about natural forming hierarchies?" Nothing, because they naturally form. Like, I'm not gonna go and make everybody's YouTube subscribers the same. And me and Jeremy has, better writing skills. I have better skills maybe on video. No one's going to change that. What they will change is saying like, "Oh, I'm president of the New York Libertarians." Nobody's going to accept that because I don't know anything about that. Like, it's not my place to do it. Also, Kevin Carson's in our chat. He brought up this point to Lark and Rose, and I thought it was good. He says he touts the right libertarian that it's not capitalism, it's cronyism. Cliche like he thought of himself. Rose, any form of business, enterprise connected with the state isn't really capitalism. Also, Rose, the tech industry and internet developed almost entirely through state-funded R&D. I think it was DARPA who invented the internet.
Yeah,
DARPA. Yeah, are examples of achievements of capitalism. So, to me, all this corporatism and capitalism, it's really hard to differentiate. The thing I would say is how you can exploit someone is you have the state is an unjustified hierarchy, and people who run them are. So if we have worker self-management industries, which I know that's a scary word, socialism, I think, and it's voluntary. You don't force people. If somebody wants to run an independent business or an independent whatever it is, group of people, without that, let them. But we also need competition from real people who are self-managing and working together, because I think they find ways to automate stuff and they wouldn't be stuck in the factory or the computer plant all day. That would also reduce things like Bezos, the MUSKs, all those type of things. Because to me, authority, where the real problem is, we have a bunch of people who say, well, authority is invested in itself. I'm this because I should be, or because I was voted in, or it used to be because God said I could be the king.
Some watery tart lobbed a sword at him.
Pretty much. Like Dennis broke that down. So I think we just need to get over like, oh, hey, I know what's best for 330 million people. I know what's best for all of you. No, you don't. We have the internet now. We'll figure out what's best for us, and we'll collaboratively work together. And will that get rid of all exploitation? Absolutely not. Will it bring it down to a level that's reasonable to deal with? I think so. And I think through consensus systems and direct democracy, you could also get rid of people who are bad actors. Not going to be perfect. You're not going to weed them all out. But if you get rid of that unjustified thing, like, I'll end it with what Thoughtsong said is an anarchist does not allow authority to legitimize itself and must beat the burden of proof to show that it's ethical and competent, or otherwise be dismantled and replaced with a more egalitarian alternative. So I think if you do that, you'll fix a lot of problems.
All right. Keith, go 5 minutes if you can, or if you want to pass, you can, but I'm pretty sure you got something to say on this.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. I come at this from, I guess, a more historicist or maybe metapolitical framework, because if we go back and we look at the beginning of the early civilizations, how did the earliest civilizations form? Well, they formed through conquest and exploitation, and slavery and mass killing and all kinds of things. If we look at the first states that formed in history in Sumer, in Egypt, in Babylon, all of these places, how did those states get to be what they were? Well, they went out and conquered other people and enslaved them, and then that gave them the ability to enslave even more people. And then how did they institutionalize this? Well, they set up a system of institutional apparatus where this system became hereditary, where the ruling classes passed it down throughout generations. And also they set up an ideological superstructure that purported to legitimize this. In ancient Egypt, for example, they worshipped the pharaoh as a descendant of the sun god. The Roman state cult, the cult of the emperor, is well known. Even when the monotheistic religions became more commonplace, they revised that. So then they just had the divine right of kings. But some variation of this system has existed since the dawn of civilization, the dawn of history. The modern systems that we have are derivative of all of this. For instance, if we look at a medieval society, we would not say that social classes or class hierarchies did not exist in a medieval period. But the institutions we have today serve the same kinds of functions. In the Middle Ages, they had the king and his ministers. Today, we have the political government and the bureaucrats. They had the king's knights. Today, we've got the military-industrial complex. In those days, they had the aristocracy. Today, we have the corporate and financial elite. Back then, they had the church. We still have that to some degree, but to a large degree, that's been eclipsed by the media, the educational systems, and secular ideologies. But they all still have the same function, and that's to legitimize and uphold the ruling class. And to the degree that all of us are not slaves or serfs or peasants, some of that has to do with technological and material development, increases in aggregate wealth, and some of it is cultural evolution. But to a large degree, it's because large numbers of people historically have stood up and said, we're not going to take it anymore. And that's the real reason that most of us have any kinds of rights or freedoms or at all. And to the degree that we don't have more rights and freedoms, it's because we haven't stood up for ourselves enough. And I think that that's a general picture of how institutionalized systems work. When it comes to more specific questions of things like, who is the ruling class and exploitation and all of that, the state is an institution, as we know, that exists to monopolize violence and protect an artificially privileged ruling class. And I tend to agree that the state is more than just the political bureaucracy. I mean, you could say that's the nexus of the state, but then beyond that, you have the wider ruling class, those who control the financial institutions and the institutions of production. And then you have the cultural elite as well, those who control the institutions that disseminate and inculcate the values that define the wider society in a philosophical, intellectual, moral, and cultural sense. And then, of course, you have imperialism, and that is particular states or ruling classes extending outward and subjugating and dominating other people, perhaps even other ruling classes. And in fact, within ruling classes, you have a layered hierarchy. And in imperialist systems, you have a layered hierarchy, just like you do in the wider society. And the particular form it takes may vary widely. For instance, a lot of people on the left have this concept called intersectionality that I think is not completely explanatory, but I do think it has merit in the sense that you have ways in which class conflict intersects with other kinds of conflict. And, Jeremy mentioned the example of Nazi Germany. Well, in Nazi Germany, it didn't matter how much wealth you had. If you were of a certain ethnicity, you're done.
Or intelligence or religion.
Right.
You made the wrong music.
Right. And then there's other systems.
They were the first victims.
Yeah. Mental illness. Yeah.
Well, there are other systems of authoritarianism that are rooted in cultural institutions. For instance, the Vatican is very much a part of the global ruling class. To claim otherwise is foolish. If you look at the history of Tibet, you see that the Tibetan Buddhist hierarchy has a similar role. You can certainly find examples of that in the Islamic world as well. So that's another form of social stratification that involves systems of exploitation. But again, the particular dynamics can vary from culture to culture. For one time I had a group of students, and I was discussing the context of intersectionality and things like race and class and gender and all these other things. And I asked the students, I said, which one of these do you think is most important? And there was this one young woman in the class, her hand went right up, and she said, gender. And she was actually from Iran, so I'm sure that influenced her thinking quite a bit. So all of these things involve power dynamics that interact with each other. I don't think that you can really reduce it down to singular determinants. Like a lot of libertarian theory has this idea, well, there's the state, like people who are politicians and bureaucrats and government employees and everybody else who's being exploited. And by the or people who live off the state. I mean, by that standard, people on things like food stamps or whatever they call it now, those people are part of the ruling class, which is absurd. And then on the other hand, somebody like Elon Musk, billionaire, is not part of the ruling class. Even though he obviously is, to claim otherwise is ridiculous. And then the Marxists are the same way. I mean, in the Marxist states that existed throughout the 20th century, you certainly had a hierarchical, exploited ruling class. In some of those countries, if you tried to form an independent labor union, they shot you. This same model of society is pretty much the norm in most cultures, most civilizations, and has been for probably 5,500 years.
Yeah. And real quick, we got some comments in chat. I'll briefly address some. We got somebody from, I think what that means is Buenos Aires, Argentina, saying they're following this channel. So they clearly got pulled in from like talking about class war. I don't know if you got pulled in from the algorithm on YouTube or one of the places I shared this, but welcome to the channel. And Tarantulas in the chat discussing things as usual. A lot of the woes we face are direct results of the most populated generation rising to power and not wanting anything to change for them. Yeah, baby boomers. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, older generations used to die off when they got old, but we're in a situation where the current ruling class, like the generation that comprises most of the ruling class, just doesn't seem to wanna exit this plane of existence.
Gerontocracy, as some people call it. Briefly before we go to Hody, Rose seemed like she was really like wanting to say something for a minute there, but I don't know.
Oh no, yeah, let everyone else finish what they were saying.
Okay, Hody, and then if John wants to say something, he can, and then we'll go to Rose and then Bigfoot.
Sure. I think one of the simplest ways to look at this, I think one of the big shames when we look at the left wing and how they analyzed what hierarchy meant. And that term arc, right, means there's a ruler there. And when Marx and Proudhon and even Kropotkin were talking about it, the issue is that they analyzed every difference as hierarchy. So if somebody was smarter than somebody else, that's a hierarchy. That's not necessarily true, right? They saw it as an inevitability that somebody smarter would end up ruling over somebody not as smart. But ethically and culturally, there's no reason that this has to be. We can simply say, oh, this person's bigger and stronger than I am, but they don't have the right to rule over me just because they're bigger and stronger. In fact, almost all of our lives are governed this way. People are afraid of anarchy, but genuinely, this is how it works. We run into bigger and stronger people all the time, and they choose not to kick the ever-living crap out of us because they have some kind of moral compass, right? This is the important thing for a society, that we have these cultural compasses to judge ourselves by. So when they're creating these societies and these hypotheticals, they're like, well, how do we account for intellectual differences? Oh, let's ban the spreading of information, right? Let's replace all entertainment with alcohol, because that way people won't, be unequal. There's no sporting event that'll be like, oh, this person's better than the other person. As opposed to people getting together and being like, hey, you did better than me at that sport. Great game. I had fun. I'm not the best at cards, but I like playing with my family. I don't feel better than them when I win, and I know I'm not worse than them when I lose as a human being. We do have different talents. Some of us are better at it than others. Some people have a natural mind for it. Some people hone their talents. That doesn't make them naturally better than me, right? And so we need to apply this also when we talk about class. When we look at the scriptures, the good guy in Christ's parables is the estate owner a lot of the time. Now, the estate owner is somebody that the servants like to work for. Why? Because he pays them well. Look what brings the child back in the parable of the prodigal son. He sees how the servants are treated, and he remembers that his father treated him right as well, and was like, oh, I want somebody who treats me well again. The difference is that this is in a voluntary society. You'll note that the primitive church, whether it was established in Ethiopia, India, or Rome, all had their members forfeit their citizenships to their nations and abandon their oaths to their countries or to their services if those services were national, and instead swore an oath to each other and to God to say, I will get your back if you get mine. It's important to note that this didn't always work perfectly. Now, the church was, you could say, communist, but if you Google this, it will say, no, the church wasn't communist because it was voluntary. So I guess you can say voluntary communism then if you want, but I'm not even trying to promote it that, because I understand like the term communism has a lot of specifics, especially Marx, the person who kind of formulated the theory, inserted a bunch of other things into communism that the church definitely didn't like, right? But in essence, they did give to each other according to what they needed. And they raised money according to what they were good at. Some people raised a lot, some people raised a little, but they all chose to give everything and then spread it around to those who needed it the most. And this is how I think it should really behave. Now, if you're looking for a system where you say, well, what if it fails? Well, I think look to that church. Because what did that church do? Well, when money didn't get to where it was supposed to go, which is an event that actually happens in the Bible, they conduct an internal review and they say, hey, the original Jews who converted, the Messianic Jews who converted to Christianity, I think they got shortchanged in that cycle. And they're starting to complain that some of these other churches got more money. Let's fix that immediately. What do? They make sure some Messianic Jews are on the board that, make sure everything gets spread out. And they maintain that transparency so that they can say, I want everybody to see what's going on. Consent is all about levels, right? We want to have maximum consent, or as much consent as we can possibly have.
Right.
When I am trying to get somebody to sleep with me, it might not be rape if I tell them I'm a rocket scientist and they sleep with me and I'm not a rocket scientist, but it's certainly a scumbag thing to do. We see this a lot with like I didn't tell you I was trans, but you just had sex with a trans person or something like that. Maybe instead of saying, oh, rape bad, what Christianity focuses on is good. We want to do the maximum good. Let's be as transparent as we can possibly be, instead of worrying about if we're technically wrong enough, which is always going to keep us on the borderline of statism, on the borderline of mandates, on the borderline of evil. Instead, let's get away from that and focus how we can do on the maximum good. So what we need to do is say, hey, let's have more transparency. Let's be better about this. Let's do better as far as our class goes. Somebody might actually own that estate and I might work on that estate, but that doesn't make them better than me. And this is where Bookchin comes in, and even though he's not a Christian, he definitely was inspired by this primitive church idea and addressed it as that way in his book. That what we say is, listen, the queen bee is not treated better than any of the other bees. She is protected because her job is vital, but she doesn't get a bigger share of food. She doesn't get more space in the hive. Right? That's just simply her role. Now, her role may be more unique than most of these other bees, and they understand the importance of that role. But that still doesn't place her in a position where she just gets to do whatever the heck she wants, and everybody else has to suffer for it. There is a reason in the Bible, and I'll close with this, that the wealthy simply can't get into heaven. And if you were part of a church that said, oh, that part about the camel going through the eye of a needle is technically a gate, that's actually not true. That's something a lot of evangelicals were told was true growing up, but it's not. Why is it that a certain amount of wealth makes it so you can no longer even get into heaven? Well, at some point when you're wealthy enough and there are people around you who we know are out there in need, and you've decided to hoard it for yourself, you're really not doing a good job, right? You're not being a good Christian. You have the capacity to help somebody and choosing not to help them. Now, help ranges from a variety of things. Remember that we're told that Mary Magdalene did not do the wrong thing by giving Christ incense, right? Maybe your passion in life is to help animals. And people could say, well, isn't it better that you help human beings first? Do what you're passionate about, as long as you're helping, right? We just want to be moving in that positive direction. We don't want to begrudge people for their charities, as long as they're being charitable. But as soon as you start hoarding that money, you're really not looking out for your fellow man. The only way to handle this is in a voluntary society where we are capable of looking at these things, disattaching ourselves from the state system. Because what happens in a voluntary society if my employer is hoarding too much money for himself, if they're not treating the employees right? You simply take off and go elsewhere. It's not maximum consent. We maybe say, man, in a voluntary society, maybe there's a point where we settle for them treating the employees good enough. No, the employees will simply leave and go to a place where they're treated as best as they could possibly be. This is what the good guy in all those parables in the state is doing in the Bible. This is the type of thing we need to demand. So on one level, I am fine with there being classes. The estate owner is indeed the owner. The servants are still the servants. Where I draw the line is the recognition that that landowner is better than the servants, because that's something the Bible says is explicitly untrue. And the landowner should prove that by treating the servants as well as he possibly can.
Rose, unless John, do you have some?
In regards to the general topic of like class theory and class analysis, I think we can sort of go a bit further in regards to Rose's idea of like starting from exploitation theory. You go a bit deeper in going through the theory of domination, which traces back to Murray Bookchin, where he rearranged the focus back from the general Marxist, because Murray Bookchin was a Marxist who then transferred to anarchism, and he took like the past concepts in regards to like, economic exploitation and tried to, in a way, generalize it to a theory of domination, which I would say it would be very similar in some senses to modern ideas of intersectionality. When it comes to the delineation of classes and the delineation of exploitation, it in the end comes down to a delineation of domination. Who are the individuals or the groups that in some way hold the power within a certain system? In economic terms, we can have, the Marxist class analysis in regards to the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. In this sort of topic of, let's say, gender, we have, the patriarchal system in which a certain concept of man and then which upholds men above, other groups such as women, leads to a domination of man over woman, but also man over man. You have in regards to sexuality, I guess if we want to summarize it, the hetero patriarchal cis-normative, that the whole big thing of buzzwords that generally makes people go to sleep. But in the end, it expresses the general idea that within different realms, there is an interrelation in regards to there being different classes born from domination and oppression. And in some ways, it's not simply saying that, wealth is bad, or that these specific group of people are bad, because those people, the dominant class, are just as much slaves as the oppressed class, because the dominant class are enslaved into the system they recreate and uphold, because if they do not uphold that system, they cannot retain their power, they cannot retain their dominating force. And the thing is, when there is no seeming alternative that will allow a person to maintain some degree of autonomy or power, it creates a sense of fear, a sense of fear, and in some ways learned helplessness, which then transforms into anger, which transforms into hate, and thus creates a system where domination is defended, is maintained, and spreads throughout the whole of the society. Domination in one place can lead to domination in another, and it requires conscious activity in order to not act in a dominant manner. I believe, in connection with the thinking of, let's say, the existentialists and Albert Camus, rebellion becomes an act where you have to make the simple act of living a type of rebellion. And in regards to our class systems, if we want to eliminate and get past through those class systems, we have to attack the structure that's at the base of it, which is a structure of domination. We have to make it so our personal relationships with each other are ones that are not one of the dominator, one of domination and oppression. And then only in that way we can then recreate it so that the greater systems are ones of not domination and oppression, but freedom and cooperation and solidarity. And so when it comes to the class analysis helps us in some ways to understand what forces are at play, that help uphold the systems of domination, and that who are benefiting from the systems of domination. And in some ways, you have to undermine those who are in power in order to also help undermine the system of power, which in the end, it will have to be some sort of fights to occur. The system of domination already creates justified violence on the part of the system. As Max Stirner would put it, the state calls its own violence law and that of the individual crime. We already have systems of violence and domination that are maintaining this kind of organization. And in some ways, we have to find different means, whether it would be nonviolent means that help, pull the rug out of the current systems of violence and domination, or we have to find other forms, I guess, of what one might have to call violence, that are in ways not helping to recreate a system of domination by the act of violence, which I would say is probably much harder than finding maybe more pacifistic routes. But I'll end my point there for now.
So before we proceed, because I'm going to go through like everybody again. Before we proceed, let's try to make sure that we can tie this into whether or not that class analysis is rooted in or like participating of an economic lens, because that's a huge like factor here. Is like, because for me, for my money, everything that everybody here just said confirms the baseline notions that I have, which is that like you cannot be at the highest echelons of wealth, you cannot be at the highest echelons of power without being also somebody who justifies the other. You can't be at the highest echelons of wealth without justifying the highest echelons of power, and you can't be at the highest echelons of power without justifying the highest ends of wealth. You are not going to be in a strong, high position of power that has any level of authority, if you're not willing to play ball with the rich. And the rich are not going to be rich. They are not going to be allowed a seat at the highest parts of that table, without justifying and accepting the rules of the powerful, at least on some level. Now there'll be little pockets of allowed rebellion so that it looks like you can do something about it, and so that the people don't rebel fully because they're like, oh, I can make a difference, I'm involved.
You can vote.
Yeah, right? Just vote about it. Cry a little harder. They'll have all these manufactured rebellions, these little pockets of pseudo participation. But you can't really do any sort of activity if you want to become one of the wealthy that sufficiently disrupts the system to disrupt the actual power mechanisms that maintain your wealth. And you cannot be powerful if you are not willing to work with those wealthy people, because the wealthy people got where they are because, it was sort of a social contract, sort of an exchange. We will help you if you help us. And this cycle of power is what I was talking about earlier, and it seems like everyone here agrees with that to some extent. And to me, that cycle is what creates the state, and that all participation and all elements of this cycle are not separate from, not assisting, but are the state. So I'm going to pass it to Rose and then Bigfoot for now. Generally, when we give answers, try to see if it phases in some way to the economic part of the theory, because that's what's really at key here. Is, can you become wealthy? Can you be a part of that part of the structure without reifying the others? Because if you can't, then it very much makes sense to say that class war through an economic lens makes complete sense. And if it doesn't, then there's a way that we can divorce that, and maybe get a man on the inside and do some subversion with a rich guy somehow. So I'd be interested to know if that was even possible. I'd be interested to know if people sort of jibe with my way of thinking. But also I'd be interested in some interplay here on an economic level. So we'll go to Rose, then Bigfoot, and then I think we'll go Keith, Kareem, Hody, John.
Right. So I'm actually glad that John kind of brought up the brought it back to the idea of domination, because I feel like maybe we should focus on exactly what the ruling class is. So we've established by now that there is a productive class and that there is an exploiting class, which can also probably be referred to as the parasitic class. So the state, at its core, is basically just the criminal gang that ultimately won out over the other criminal gangs. They have claimed the use or the justified use of force and coercion over a given geographic location. So things like forcing you to give them a percentage of what you've produced is, if it's the state doing it, that's considered normal and okay. If anyone else did that, it would be a crime per their standards. They can enslave you and force you to fight in their wars. They can abduct you and call it an arrest if you violated some rule they put in place. So there's always going to be that small percentage of people who manage to get into the good graces of the state. They're benefiting from the protection rather, that the state provides against other gangs. So they manage to provide the state with what they need. They get into its good graces. Over time, those people it creates basically a feedback mechanism by which they become more and more closely tied with the state until eventually they become indistinguishable from it. So when you have a state that has a regulatory apparatus, these are the entities that ultimately are able to carry out regulatory capture. They send their lobbyists to say, well, maybe we can negotiate with these people and they'll pass regulations that aren't going to hurt us, but conveniently, they'll hurt our competition down the road. Yeah, exactly. So eventually, like, they become so closely tied with the state, and the state grows reliant on them because they fund things like re-election campaigns, that they agree not to turn on the state because the state is benefiting them. It's protecting them from their potential competition. So they want the state in place. Like, it's a common misconception that large corporations don't want the state because the state's restraining them. Like, they want the state because the state is what is propping them up. So over time, you get these, it creates a vicious cycle where certain entities are benefiting from the state is benefiting from them. Eventually, they become one and the same, and that's why I just prefer to use the term ruling class. Now, one thing that happened within the past few hundred years, though, is markets are one of those things that just arise naturally in any society, like any economy of scale. You have markets and you have currency arising. One thing that happened within the past couple hundred years, though, you had state monopoly currency and you had central banking, like centralized centralized fractional reserve banking and inflationary fiat currencies. This is what gives the ruling class the ultimate control over the population for the reasons that I stated previously, because that gives them the ultimate means of controlling the time preference of the working class and keeping the working class in a state of basically perpetual debt slavery and desperation.
Yes. Well, not physical notes, but I have been thinking in great detail about everything that everyone has said. So I have. Yeah, no, I just carve it into my flesh so I can read the bloody motes on my arms. Anyway, so I have two major things to say. One thing, I can answer your question, Jeremy, and answer your second question about whether or not we would ever be able to get the rich to help us, like a man on the inside. So I have a general, I guess, a sort of metaphor to frame the structure of how I see things. Imagine a very simplified version of a nuclear reactor. You have a uranium core, which produces energy over a long period of time that excites the material around it. And you have a shell that fundamentally separates the material from the working fluid. And then you have the working fluid, usually water, which is turned into steam to drive a turbine. You describe the relationship between wealth and power as a cycle, and that is what led me to this idea. I see the relationship between wealth and power not necessarily as untouched as the relationship between water and uranium in a nuclear reactor, but in a similar sense, they both drive each other to keep the process going. The uranium would melt down and become useless and not workable if not kept cool by the water. The water would not move if not heated by the uranium. I believe that wealth is best described as the water in this situation, and the ability to do violence or to command others to do violence on your behalf as the uranium. The uranium allows for the use of wealth to do work in terms of exploitation on the populace. Without the power of violence backing your actions, your wealth, which in real terms is simply the things that you have that you can use to satisfy your goals of consumption, because that is essentially the closest thing we can get to a specific definition of wealth. I think we could probably all agree, because if you can't use it, it's not true wealth. If you can't, if it's not going to satisfy you personally, then it's capital more than it is wealth, right? Wealth is explicitly that which you personally can use to satisfy your own desires. Anyway, wealth without the impetus of violence to energize it into exploitation is generally used to satisfy one's own desires without exploitation through voluntary exchange on the market, voluntary contribution. Communes can be formed off of wealth because it takes some form of wealth in order to maintain human life. Like we have needs. The things that satisfy those needs are wealth. So without a power generator to excite that wealth into exploitation, it tends to stay at a voluntary level so that even those who are wealthy are motivated to not exploit others, because without any backing, they will lose their ability to use their wealth in order to gain what they want from other people. Nobody would shop with them. Nobody would work with them. Everybody would ostracize them. You can be as rich as you want, but as I said in my first statement, with no one to trade with, your riches mean nothing. Now, my second point, and I think that this is pretty much where I'll end here, is that I want to make sure that we understand specifically the definitions of the words that we use. I want to see if everybody agrees with these sorts of terms. So class can be anything, any group of people that can be identified by a single attribute. So for instance, men are a class, women are a class, white people are a class, black people are a class, people who ride bicycles to work are a class. The difference between class as a general term and class analysis, class interests, that sort of thing, is when there is some sort of factor that unifies a class beyond their single notifying characteristic. So for instance, if everyone in the world agreed that you see a man on a bike, you shoot him on sight, people who ride bikes would not just be a class, but would have a unified class interest in survival, being the people who ride on bikes. And in a similar sense, just being wealthy doesn't necessarily make someone have a similar class interest to another wealthy person, especially if they're in direct competition. But if they both have a common interest in maintaining their wealth as a means of exploitation, then that binds their interest and allow them to properly be considered having common class interests, which leads to class conflict. I think that binding agent in the modern day is most of the time the state, but it is possible for that binding agent to be other factors that would not be traditionally considered a state. I consider things like company towns, mining interests, that sort of thing from the 1800s to be a similar example of wealthy people not just having their own interests, but having a class interest in keeping down their workers, because they were essentially let free to completely kidnap these people, not let them leave, all those external factors that moved it from just wealth to exploitative wealth, if that makes sense. I would
sorry.
just to make sure that I'm clear.
It turns out my mic was muted. I think that was. I wonder.
I heard you.
I know it muted for the audience. I wonder how much I didn't get a chance to say. I muted it a while ago. I muted it while I was like typing some shit in the responses here. But
I don't think you missed anything because we didn't see you talking and not making noise.
Well, yeah, it was muted for the audience, OBS. Yeah. All right, so let me just. So, I think in terms of nobody was bringing that up before, so I don't think it was a problem. But the general thing that I could say is I think that it's behaving as though the wealth has not already been excited, and that it requires the exciting influence as sort of an externality. Go.
Let me just not be misunderstood. I am not saying that wealth today is unexcited. I am saying wealth in a vacuum has to be excited in order to be spurred into exploitation.
Right.
Wealth today has been excited since fucking 300 years at least. Right. I don't want to be misunderstood. Right. The pedigree is there. It is already happening.
Right. So that's what I'm saying. So in terms of the modern day, it's very valid and extremely valuable to consider a sort of class war perspective. It's like extremely understandable for somebody like, for instance, Kareem to share a thing that says that a cop is a class traitor, because a cop does not own class. but they are a member of the owning class, because without them, the owning class would not be able to continue owning they're parts of the class that make them part of the owning class. The police are the ones who enforce their property. They're the ones who break strikes. They're the ones who enforce the laws that stomp on workers and other people in various parts of various intersectional alliances. They're the people and the reason why the state can get away with what it does, and how the wealth can continue to cyclically transfer and be excited by power. Because they are the power element of it, driving the factors, and troops are just a world police, right? And neither of these groups of people are particularly well paid or compensated, so they oftentimes consider themselves a part of the working class because they're at the bottom levels and they're not making a whole lot of money. But they have to be told that, in fact, no, you're not a part of the working class if you're the people who the owning class uses to crush the working class in times of rebellion. And so that was the general idea of calling police class traitors, and the thing that I think is understandable from that perspective. And I don't think there's anything particularly incorrect about that analysis with those mechanisms in place. So,
well, it's that, yeah, they themselves are members of the working class, but they're being wielded to
Working class
interests and attack their fellow working class members at the behest of the ruling class.
Right.
Yeah.
And Frank,
that's why most people who would subscribe to anything sort of resembling our philosophy would find them so repulsive.
Right, and Lee Armstrong in chat says, I wouldn't say they're part of the class, they're servants of the class. I would say that means that they're the same thing, because if you serve the class by crushing the rebels against the class, I would call you part of that class. But that's me, I could be. Go ahead.
So, just to be clear, my direct response to that meme in that group chat was not that I necessarily disagreed with them being class traitors. I said, better be the fringe classes, mate. Economic classes are kind of bunk when you examine them. Now, I understand that was probably inflammatory and came off the wrong way, but essentially what I was trying to say, and what I think is my main point in choosing to use a different class definition, is that I would automatically consider cops to be a part of the ruling class, because they're not, and like what Keith said earlier, I'm not one of these people who considers a single dollar from the government received making you a part of the ruling class. I'm not stupid. Obviously there has to be wealth involved in order for the ruling class to consider you a part of it. An example with this would be like the difference between getting a block of cheese from the government in the 30s versus being a farmer with a massive subsidy and incentive to burn your crops to raise the price, directly instructed by the government. Those are two entirely different cases, even though they could be considered working class. You have farmers and you have people who work regular jobs. The farmers actually had enough wealth at the time in terms of food production abilities to be considered a member of what I would consider the ruling class. In a similar sense, cops, while technically paid hourly wages and are technically laborers, are in no way, shape, and form I would consider a class member, and thus they wouldn't be a class traitor, because they're already a part of the ruling class as their apparatus, as their arm of enforcement.
So, go ahead, Grim.
Okay, the only problem I have with that is, yeah, I see where you're coming from, that they are actually they're playing games, or you could even say they are part of the dominator class, or they're doing the same thing. But I still feel that comes back to an unjustified hierarchy, in the sense that they're saying, well, because I forget what experiment they did with this, but they had people go into a bank I think it was a financial institution. I have to look it up. And then they told them to do stuff and they didn't do it. But then they had people dress up as cops or people dress up as doctors. And they're like, do this, do that. And they're like, why did you do all this? Oh, the gun, the badge. I saw this. He's an authority figure. Why is he an authority? Oh, because he put on essentially a costume and said, I'm the expert. Okay, I'm the expert. And I'm not going to say okay, fine, no job should have a uniform, but it's interesting to me that people will literally say like, okay, here's the, and I would actually put it like a chain of command. Like there's regular people, then there's enforcers, then there's the politicians, then there's the people who control the politicians, there's the people who control them. There's a bunch of levels to this whole crazy thing. So I don't know if I would put cops, you could put them in the same class as in they're working with the exploiters, but I don't think they're anywhere near like the top. For looking at the exploitation class as a food chain of bigger fish, I don't see them anywhere there. I don't know how you guys feel about his research, but and I don't like his presentation, fake ass anarchist. I actually left, started reading Keith stuff, but Mark Passio has actually worked with people who he was a former member of the Satanic Church, and he's worked with people who have a little bit of I guess upper echelon thing over these cops, and they do not talk to them well. He's like, they call them our pets, our animals, our attack dogs. And same thing with the military. It's just like, you go get these people. And they don't actually like the cops in the military. They actually despise them. It's like, I can't believe these people are doing what we tell them to do. They're attack dog. Like they should have exercise critical thinking. Like, hey, maybe an authority figure telling me to throw away my soul so I can beat somebody else or hurt it or exploit someone else is not good. So in one way, yes, in one way, no. That being said,
to be fair,
a lot of holes.
To be fair, I would say that almost every single politician hates every other single politician at their core, because they're all competing for the same kind of power.
Grasping hands always grasp what they can.
Yeah, exactly. I guarantee you just about every single senator resents every other single senator for anything they do, basically because they are competing for the public eye and for the right to rule the apparatus. Some might be different, but your career politicians, they're going to be loathsome little individuals.
Yeah, I'm sure Keith has something to say about like the general power structures. So we'll go to Keith, then John, then Hody.
Yeah, and I can. Oh, sorry.
Well, if we want to talk about the question of whether the relationship between wealth and power, I think a good rule of thumb is the richer somebody is, the more likely they receive their wealth from some form of collusion with the state and with political institutions. The higher you get in the socioeconomic system in terms of just raw wealth, in terms of either income or assets, the more likely the more you're going to have to collaborate with the state, or the more you're going to have to utilize legal privileges of some particular type. For instance, if I start a lemonade stand and my lemonade stand does pretty well, and then that gives me the means to open, say, 4 more lemonade stands, and then maybe share the profits with people that I get to staff my other lemonade stands. Maybe I can do that without exploitation. But if I'm going to have a nationwide or international chain of lemonade stores, then at that point I'm going to be dependent on a whole lot of state intervention. I'm going to be dependent on intellectual property law. I'm going to be dependent on the state to enforce contracts. I'm going to be dependent on the state for trade-related protection and all kinds of other things. We have to remember that a lot of these minarchist libertarians who talk about, well, the state should be limited only to contract enforcement and upholding property rights and this kind of thing, but none of that is value neutral. This idea that all of that kind of stuff is somehow value neutral, and it's not. How property rights are defined in the law in the first place, by itself creates the foundation for a particular economic system. Historically, there have been many different ways in which so-called property rights have been defined. And that can vary widely from culture to culture and time period and different types of societies. Contract enforcement, what constitutes a legitimate contract in the first place? For instance, a modern court probably would not uphold an outright slavery contract, but many in past societies did. So it's not like these are objective concepts. if the richer you are, the more you have access and control over resources, and the more you're able to exercise power by directing the actions of others, the more you're going to have to rely upon some form of coercion to do that. It would be interesting to go through the standard Forbes lists of billionaires and all of these kinds of things, and see how many of these people derive their wealth from some sort of involvement with the state, institutions that involved legal privileges for themselves.
100% guaranteed.
I would guess it would be about 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. There's no self-made billionaire in existence.
Every single one of them, if you consider the fact that I can't call myself their company.
Yeah. I mean, there are different levels of this, obviously, but when it comes to the question of exploitation of, say, labor, I think a good rule of thumb there is to determine whether a person is being exploited as, say, a worker. What is the worker's exit cost? Like a common argument that a lot of your more mainstream libertarians and free market conservative people like that use is, well, if you don't like your boss, just quit. Go work somewhere else.
Yeah, just leave. You can
right.
totally
So yeah, but that's always that's just a variation of the idea you hear from flag wavers, where they say, well, if you don't like your country, leave. Love it or leave it, whatever. It's the question is exit cost. The exit cost of that are extraordinarily high. I think that to the degree a worker is not being exploited, it would be the degree to which their exit costs are low. If you're somebody that works in one of these old-fashioned company towns from the 19th century, where literally one corporation owns the entire town, and then they pay you in scrip, where you buy your essentials from the company store, and then you live in a barracks that's provided to you by the company, then that's not much different than outright slavery.
Yeah, you lose everything, all your basic necessities if you leave.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
it's like that line from the immortal philosopher, motionless and white, in the land of the free, you're a slave to your wealth.
Yeah,
it's there's different levels of this, obviously. Like I don't necessarily think that any form of wage labor is exploitation per se. Again, it depends on the context and the mutual benefit to the people involved and the various exit costs involved and things like that. But even more medium-sized corporations tend to be very exploitive of labor. Case in point, I used to be an HR manager for a regional company that had about a dozen or so locations. And one of the main complaints I used to get from the top management was that my division's payroll costs were always too high. They were always like, you got to keep payroll costs down. You got to keep payroll costs down. And what they were really telling me was, well, we want you to pay your underlings starvation wages, because that's going to increase our profit margin. Now, that's not the only reason to keep costs low. There are principles of business involved, but at the same time, that's an ongoing conflict that you see even in fairly small level corporations. I used to be a part of another company years ago, one of these multi-level marketing companies, and the owners were worth about $100 million. And if you want to talk about exploitation, I mean, the way that this worked is that it didn't matter how productive you were for this company. If they decided you weren't cost effective, they had the right to just terminate you. They would kick people out that had been in the company for years, and you might be used to getting $60,000 a year in residuals, but if they decide you're too not cost effective, you're finished. No more checks. And, you don't have to do anything wrong. It's in terms of violation of policies or anything like that. I know I worked for another company some years ago. A guy who owned about 5 restaurants. And this was a fairly small chain, and talk about exploitation of labor. I mean, this guy, the owner, he went out of his way to engage in actual wage theft. Like, what he would do is he would hire, usually very uneducated people from, often fairly shady backgrounds, often a lot of street people. He'd hire them to do all the shit work, and then he just wouldn't pay them. He'd say, when payday came, he would just say, "I'm sorry, no checks." And then he would try to do the same thing again. And he ended up getting sued over this. But But this kind of thing goes on all the time in the business world. There's this idea that some libertarians have where they idealize businessmen as sort of like Nietzsche and Superman or something like that. The Ayn Rand model, which is nonsensical. It's the overwhelming majority of capitalists I've ever encountered personally were basically making their profits through underpaying their workers or ripping off consumers, or often doing all of it at the same time, and often in collusion with political institutions and legal institutions. I mean, even at the local level of government, for example, if you look at zoning laws, if you look at land use laws, all of that is structured to create protection for established interest. Like one reason housing is expensive in many jurisdictions because zoning laws are so restrictive in terms of where you can build housing, and that's about artificially inflating the value of established real estate interests, but through constricting the supply of housing. And often you have landlords and property management companies and developers engaging with governmental institutions at the state and local level to make this happen. So this is something that exists at every level, all throughout society.
Yeah.
Well, I had a question about
things.
something.
Seems like you. Go ahead.
No, because I wanted to get Keith's perspective on this, because this is something I've debated with a lot of people. And yeah, I agree. A lot of people are ripping people off, and I worked for the exact same things. What keep people's profits down. There's a Spanish company called Mondragon. Now, I've heard everything on the spectrum. Some people, and it's apparently a co-op. Some people say it's exploitive. Some people say it's not exploitive. Some people say it's kind of in between. They didn't exactly get it right. My understanding is kind of like it's a workers' co-op. So if we're comparing workers' co-ops to capitalism, is it still exploitative, or what's your opinion on Mondragon?
Mondragon, I haven't looked into that for a while, but yeah, it's a federation of co-ops in Spain. It's been around since, I think, the mid-'70s, so it's about 50 years old at this point. But I believe the way that works is the cooperative federation is technically owned by the workers, but then the workers as an organization hire their management. So it's structured pretty much like a standard corporate entity, even if the workers are technically owners. I remember at one point they went on strike. I think it was like the workers at Mondragon went on strike against themselves, I guess, or against I don't remember all the details.
How do you do that?
I'd have to go back and look it up to get all the details. But it is an interesting system they have, but it's not really the idealized system that a lot of anarcho-syndicalists have, where everything is owned and operated directly by the workers for the workers. It's has more of a conventional business model, but I think the ownership structure is such that the workers are at least partial owners. I don't know if it may be something like within Germany is called co-determination, where you have a corporation that's a fairly conventional corporation, but then worker representatives have to have a number of seats on the board of directors, meaning the union representatives and things like that. So it may be something more like that.
And real quick, so John and then Rose, because Rose had something she wanted to say, but John also had something he wanted to say, probably 15 minutes ago. So if you still got that in your head, John, feel free to go.
It was more having to do, I kind of want, when we're talking in regards to the whole, the thing with, person on like food stamps, I think it's important to note how, at least in right libertarian movements, it's not that they don't have a form of class analysis or a class, or like a sort of, not a class system, a class theory, but the issue comes in regards, especially with those further right in libertarian circles, where the class theory does envelop anyone, whoever it is. Doesn't matter if they're like the actual powerful people or if they're, someone who's lowly, and because of because of the amount of at least accountability that the state does try to have towards its citizens, those who are so low and oppressed that they are having to get food stamps, they are having to get that because there is a problematic idea, I would say, where anyone who is benefiting from the state, even if it is those who would be in other class theories or in other analyses of class, would be, and I would say rightfully so, put as a part of the oppressed peoples. They are viewed as, one term used by Marx was the Lumpenproletariat, and another term later used by, Rothbard, the late Rothbard, is parasites. And I think even Konkin, as much good as he did intend, I think his use of the term parasitic, in some ways, not intentionally by him, helped take in possibly certain unhealthy ideas, which, granted, he was able to at least explain enough that it wasn't hard to understand why he used the term and how it did not include necessarily the oppressed classes. But when you get to people who are adjacent to him, like, for example, J. Neil Schulman, or if you get to people who promote themselves as agorists, you get a weird thing where within that right libertarian sphere, you have those who are seen as oppressed, viewed as a kind of parasitic part of the ruling class in some ways. And I think even with some of our framings, like with Rose's earlier framing in regards to the productive class and the exploitative class, that in some ways is an issue because it is not just the productive class who are being exploited and dominated over. Children are not necessarily productive, but we have issues in regards to the domination of children, both in literal things of abuse within a bunch of systems within the church, within government-run schools, within maybe even private schools, within the child foster system, And then we also have the whole things in regards to older folks, the weak, those who are older, who are weaker, who cannot fend for themselves and need the support of others. They have to deal with issues of abuse, of manipulation, of domination. You have the mentally ill who are not necessarily part of the productive class. You have, in regards to patriarchal systems of the past, women who were not necessarily productive. They were, but they had a certain role and they were dominated over. You have those who are like gay or lesbian or trans who, regardless of whether they were productive or not, they were marginalized and dominated over. And I think especially in modern times when we have these types of class analyses, we have to be very careful. And I think the distinction that Murray Bookchin made in regards to domination and which Chomsky made in regards to hierarchy help create a better picture in regards to class analysis and class theory that in the libertarian movement is very much needed, because without it we help perpetuate certain ideas of class that, instead of fighting against either the system that helps uphold oppression or those who or those who are the oppressors who are helping to uphold this system of oppression, we become antagonistic to those who are oppressed. So we get the things like late Rothbard, kick out the bums from the street, like unleash the cops on the streets to get rid of the bums. Where will we go? Where will they go? Who cares? You get people who, you have Jeremy Kaufman, whose whole thing is in some ways trying to justify a kind of oppression based on almost an idea of attacking what could be called Lupenproletariat elements. And so it's very
deport the homeless.
Deport the homeless. And so especially this kind of conversation is important in the sense that we need to have a libertarian movement that understands ideas of oppression and ideas of domination so as to have a better class theory and class analysis to not allow the oppressed to be pushed into the oppressors and antagonized against, because one, the fight of having us fight against the oppressed simply it's divide and conquer on the part of those who would uphold the system of domination and of what would probably be called the ruling class. And also it makes the libertarian movement just recreating systems of domination and authoritarianism because the choice is being made to fight against the oppressed instead of creating a society where they are no longer oppressed.
So we've got a thing in chat, real quick. Feels like you're belittling these people by calling them bums. He's quoting somebody else. He's not actually endorsing that view. He's quoting somebody else who was a prominent libertarian, and Rothbard was incredibly fucked later on in his life, and he believed that the homeless, that the bums were, quote, a petted and cosseted parasite class of where people were ruled by those who, by those in those positions, ruled by the people in welfare. And so he was just opposing that by bringing it up. He wasn't actually co-signing calling them bums. But yes, yeah, absolutely, I agree that that's a dehumanizing word. This is not the Young Turks. This is way better than them. In fact,
Yeah. Wait. Are you implying that you can't so much as quote or like the work of some some of the work by someone unless you're just gonna endorse every single thing they've ever said? Wow, what a concept.
Well,
I gotta go ahead and I got a jet, guys. I got work.
Well,
excuse me. Sorry, the people in the woods are getting close. I've got to run. But this was fun.
Real quick, if you've got anything else you want to say, feel free to, and we'll sort of probably wrap soon because I think that this is probably close to the discussion, and we might have further discussions at some point to drill down on issues. But I want to make sure that you had as much to say as you wanted to say. So, anything else you wanted to say before you book?
I think I said most everything that I needed to say. I will leave on this comment. I think we should unleash the anarchists to get rid of the rich in our community. And where will they go? Who cares?
Yeah, agreed.
Hopefully they'll go to every part of this society and build agorist counter-economic movements.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully. All right. Well, take it easy, guys.
Be well.
Having me on.
Good luck in the woods.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
So we'll go to Hody next. So I guess because we're coming up on 2 hours. So let's do before the 2 hours is up, we'll do that will be sort of I think probably John said what he was gonna say. So we'll do Hody, Keith, Kareem and Rose on general closing statements and sentiments, and then if there's something John wants to cap off his previous sentiments with, he can feel free at the after all that.
Yeah, you wanted us to talk about economics, and that does have a lot to play when we talk about class warfare. Look, the bottom line is when a central banking agency has $2 and they lend it out and they say, sure, I'll give you these $2, but I need $2.50 back. The thing is, because they're the central banking agency, they know that that 50 cents doesn't exist. So this necessarily means that people have to be in debt. If you are a person who's not in debt, it means it's come at the expense of everybody else around you. Now, I know that sounds terrible, and I am not in debt, but you have to understand that this is how central banking works. Look, economics is a PVE system. They even use the Robinson Crusoe example in economics when we talk about how scarce resources get allocated. But we've turned it into a PvP system. The only way you get to the top is by being better and smarter than everybody else around you. It's not the way economics is supposed to work at a core level. I would say that when I look at the Bible, we're trying to define, I think, a little bit too much. I think we're trying to define, well, are these people technically in the class? Are they not in the class? How about instead we look at people by their hearts and by their fruits? Right? Like, what do they produce? And I think that this is the best way to tell. This is something that anarchists have actually always historically struggled with when we ask ourselves who are the authoritarians. And then the anarchists in Europe go and murder a bunch of nuns because they're authoritarians, because they believe in God, who's an authority figure. And that ended up not being great for that movement. And so, literally tens of thousands of murders by these anarchists, right? Like a really bad system. And so what we forgot to do is we looked at all these definitions and we got too technical about it. But what we should have done is just been like, listen, there are a lot of people who are in the military, who are cops, who are fundamentally doing bad things, but who are also fundamentally misled. Let's be honest, we know for a fact cops prey on the stupid. They don't allow intelligent people to be in their force, right? Stupid people are still children of God. Right? What we need to do is take them out of that system, as opposed to just burning them down along with it to get them on our side. People are so used to being cutthroat, and some of the people who are most resistant to this are those who have been really good at cutting throats. Again, if you are just not in debt, you have had to cut throats to get there because of the way central banking works. Now, that's a brutal way of seeing it. And of course, you're just trying to say, listen, I'm just trying to be responsible with my own finances. But the truth is if you're positive, well, everybody has to be negative, right? The central bank knows it didn't give out that amount of money. And so you've had to go against brother, sister against sister, as the Bible says. We have siblings fighting against each other, but we're all children in Christ. So I think the important thing is to analyze, let's look at people's works. We can argue, well, technically, is this estate owner part of the class if he gives so much of his... Let's just examine what his fruits are. Let's examine what the fruits of this factory worker are, and see, hey, is this guy kind of on our side or kind of not? When we see somebody producing bad fruits, and listen, Christians get really guilty of this. Muslim immigrates illegally. They should have done it legally. We get enraged. But then their pastor gets convicted of a sex scandal, and they're like, hey, listen, guys, everybody falls short. Everybody sins a little bit, right? Let's be reasonable with ourselves here, right? Let's notice when somebody's out of sync. I'm not saying we can't forgive people who mess up, but let's make them go on that repentance journey, right? All of us have probably had to go on a repentance journey at some point. If you have a zeroed out or positive bank account, you've gotten that at the expense of other people. Now, you've had to. You love yourself, right? But we also love our neighbors. This system isn't fair. And so we do need to target things that actually target the system. Oftentimes, the problems with class warfare is we end up targeting innocent people. We end up targeting each other, and we get nowhere closer to ending this class warfare. Right now, this system is set up so that it is PvP, and we need to stop participating in PvP battles altogether and demand a return to PvE. Anything else, I think, is just missing the mark. And that's it. That's it. Thanks again for having me on this week. It was a lot of fun.
We'll go to Keith.
Well, since the general theme of this program has been class and economic exploitation, one thing that I think we're going to see more of in the future is that class politics is going to make something of a comeback. If we go back and look at politics as they were, say, in the late 19th century, we see that class was really one of the defining characteristics of political conflict back then. And right now, the world is moving into a situation that's very similar to the 19th century because the digital revolution and digital capitalism and globalization and all of the things associated with that are having the same kinds of impact that the Industrial Revolution did in the 19th century, and including the disparity between social classes and if you look at the statistics, for example, concerning wealth distribution patterns, right now in the United States, we're in a new Gilded Age. It's very similar to the wealth distribution patterns we saw about 100 years ago prior to the Great Depression. So class politics are likely to, well, I'm sure, are going to make a comeback in the future. And one thing that we want to avoid is we want to avoid some of the problems that came out of class struggle in the classical labor era. For instance, you started to get these ideologies, these authoritarian ideologies like communism and fascism that claimed to be worker representative ideologies, and ended up creating states that were just as bad as the states that came before. And I think that, unfortunately, many libertarians are falling down on the job when it comes to this kind of consideration. All the time, I come across libertarians who are influenced by this kind of Ayn Rand type of thinking, where someone like Elon Musk is like a Nietzschean Uberman or something of that nature. And that's an incredibly foolish viewpoint for people who claim any kind of anti-authoritarian values or libertarian values to try to promote. Number one, it's terrible from a marketing perspective. It's not going to sell. I mean, it's like when even Ron Paul, when he was doing his presidential campaigns, he had to tone down some of his economic conservatism, like abolishing food stamps and Medicare and that kind of stuff. So that's just a dead end. So I would definitely advise libertarians to move away from that kind of thinking. And then another problem I've seen is a lot of libertarians that don't really have opposition to the state or the ruling class as a core value at all. Instead, it tends to be more of, they're against the government, because the government is run by libs, and it's all just about taxes and guns and owning the libs, and most of these people are not libertarians in any sense. They're just nationalists or something comparable. That's not to say left-leaning libertarians are beyond criticism either. That might be a different area to look at. But so I think that in the future, as class-based politics starts making a comeback due to the kinds of conditions that we see emerging, if libertarians want to have influence and be a voice and move people away from authoritarian ideologies and philosophies, it's important to address some of these issues of class and economic power in a way that's actually, first of all, true, and number one, reasonable, and in a way that most people can relate to. It's just not going to sell if libertarians are out there saying, well, the real problem with poor people is that they just don't recognize the superiority of their masters, and they need to get over this resentment and get a job and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, that's just not a
stop being poor.
They're just jealous of people who have more than them. Clearly.
Yeah. Well, that kind of thinking is a dead end. I mean, as long as libertarians promote that kind of idea, the libertarianism is not going to have any more influence than it currently does.
Oh, tell me about it. Yeah, I have struggled with this for years, with trying to get libertarians to learn how to actually sell their ideas to the general public, because so many of it is just a dead end. Like the whole way they talk about healthcare, for example. Oh, well, no one owes you healthcare. Okay, but you need to know how to approach the topic. You need to start by explaining to people why exactly their healthcare is so expensive, like which particular state interventions led to the cost being so inflated, and then kind of ease into the idea that deregulation would actually increase the availability of affordable healthcare. Like, not just start out with the whole idea that you just want to enslave me and make me enforce me to pay for your healthcare, even if that's
Or
technically
enslaved
true.
doctors. That's another bullshit thing they say.
Oh, God, yeah. Like, they act like the state doesn't already own roughly half of our labor, okay? They already expropriate probably, like, at the end of the day, roughly half of everything we make. So people are aware of this fact, and then they see other countries paying, like, charging similar amounts in taxes, but providing healthcare that, well, oftentimes deeply flawed, is still, at the point of service free. So they wonder why we can't do the same. So, yeah, bad libertarian messaging. I could go on about that for hours.
Yeah, and like in terms of healthcare, just like watch Michael Moore's Sicko and try to be that sympathetic. If you're not, you fucking lose by default. Because Sicko did really well and it made his points and it made like a lot of people sympathetic to his ideas. If you can't sway people in that way or better, shut the fuck up.
Pretty much. Yeah, I was like, what I was getting at there was, so many of my fellow libertarians have what I would describe as a very surface level understanding of their philosophy. Like they'll be like, in theory, they understand that they don't live under a free market and that the state picks winners and losers, and that crony corporations did not earn their wealth by actually providing services that people want and by gaining it legitimately, that they are privileged by the state. But then, because they don't fully grasp the idea of systemic coercion, they'll turn around and they'll defend these giant corporations when they hear anyone, for example, like saying, oh, Amazon sucks and Bezos is an exploitative asshole and blah, blah, blah. Their knee-jerk response is because they've been taught, or because like their analysis ends at, well, capitalism good. Their knee-jerk response is to turn around and defend Bezos. When, no, I think if you understand that he's just a crony capitalist that gained most of his wealth via state privilege and is propped up by state privilege, you'll understand that, you don't need to defend him, okay? Like, yeah, he is part of the exploiting class. You are part of the productive class. You do not need to defend someone who is part of the class that's oppressing you.
Yeah, and just acknowledging and understanding that. And I'll get into that in my closing statement. Kareem, you are currently in jacking off into the table mode, so I don't know if you're still there, but you're free to give a closing statement if you are. But right now your camera's off, so we're all assuming you're jacking off under the table. Also, your mic is off, so that's definitely what you're doing. We'll move to John.
Must be a particularly enjoyable session then.
Yeah, it's been going on for a while. John, we'll go with you while Kareem is lubing with tubing.
I'm not sure I really have too much else to say. I think my last statement seemed for pretty much was a good wrap up for my whole position on this.
Plug your shit then.
Liberty Centuries on Twitter.com, now called X.com, but I'm going to keep on calling it Twitter.com.
But I won't
Twitter.com still redirects to X.com, so just use Twitter.com. At Liberty Centuries, we also have a YouTube, mainly of recordings of LNC meetings so far, as well as Medium, because that's where we post our articles. Check it out. We'll be posting one soon about a state affiliate. Yeah. Bazinga.
And additionally, it's being said in chat that you're reminding people of the antagonist from Grandma's Boy, and that you sound like a robot. So maybe someday you'll be courageous enough to do a voice reveal. But for now, yeah, definitely go follow all of that. And also, so Kareem, if you can't hear us, then it's probably gonna clock before you're done, because like we don't really have time to wait for you to come back. But um, anybody who hasn't already, who likes this sort of shit, who's new here from the algorithm or from one of the places I fucked the link into, feel free to like and subscribe to this. This is fairly good content, I think, in terms of actually drilling down on some issues. So if that sounds like what you're into, like I named the shit like an asshole because it draws eyes, and apparently the algorithm likes that. But I want this place to be a place where people can generally have like nuanced and mature discussions. So feel free to
What
do
was
that.
the description? We were described as unicorns frolicking in a meadow of flowers or something, because it was like different types of anarchists all getting along and talking theory at one point.
No, it's not getting along necessarily. A discussion on rich people and how the rich are the ruling class, or are they? Different guest perspectives on the state of anarchy and the nature of rebellion. Words about words and things to say. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just going to say yes. If you have any interest in Libertarian Party politics, definitely follow the Liberty Sentries account. That has quickly become one of the best accounts for keeping up on current news about the bullshit that's going on within the LP. The LP, for those of you who don't follow their internal politics, is going through a rather nasty civil war at the moment, and Liberty Sentries is doing a great job reporting on what's going on.
Oh, and Kareem, it's being said that in the chat that you need to duck out less by one of the repeat viewers. So that's up to you. But you can give your closing statement now before I give mine. We're on closing statement time.
Right, yeah. No, I got it. Every time I stream, someone's like, call me, or like, I need help with something.
People like to see your pretty face.
Apparently, but everybody
They don't want you to duck out.
Everybody wants tech support. Everybody, when I'm not doing anything, people are like, and they're like, oh, you're busy with something? Hey, I need help.
Yep.
You got to get hours and just tell people, I can't be fucked right now. We got to do the sex later.
Yeah. I'm getting to that point. Eventually, I get to that point. But freelancing makes it difficult. Anyway, simply put, I am Kareem. You can find me at Kareem6633 on X. You can also find me at Anarch Unity, and I recommend Attack the System. And the Mad Liberty Project is cool stuff. And check out It Had to Be Said. He's putting out some good stuff. Hopefully, I'll do a collab with him soon. And Zachary Marlowe.
So, all right, I guess since we're all wrapped, I'll just say this. We'll probably do more streams on this subject specifically.
Don't forget Keith.
Oh yeah, Keith.
What the heck?
Do you have a closing statement beyond what you said?
No, not really.
Because my brain is telling me that we went through the cycle and you were right after Hody, but I might be full of shit.
Yeah, I was just saying that libertarians, I think, need to develop a better approach to class theory and class conflict than what is often the case.
Yeah.
Yes, this is a hill I'll probably die on.
And one thing I'll say, we're gonna do another one of these on class, because it's something that I think really, like, if we start really analyzing and hammering down on the actual connections between certain elements of the ruling class and wealth and all this connections and power and shit, that we can really start actually exposing some evil. And this is the thing. To me, and I'll sort of use this as a teaser for the next one where we talk about class, I look at everything as one giant conspiracy corkboard. I see all of this as interconnected and interplayed, like money, power, influence that goes back millennia. And ultimately, I don't see a way to have a competent and cohesive power analysis without also saying that people's economic class is directly, currently at least, tied to their to the power that got that wealth and that wealth feeds back into. Tarantulas called it a tithe into the power system that created it. That's pretty accurate. Also, again, my voice is fucked because I was like, I done did screamed fuck a lot before this stream got started. But the general gist of it is that if we start to look at it that way, then the state ceases to be one superstructure at the top where all of these tendrils are like potentially connected to it or not, and it starts to be the way that the structure is and holding us all on puppet strings dangling from its fingers. It's more like accurate to me to say that the entire structure is this way, and that the reason we have such a powerful enemy to fight is because of that. And so for me, my point entirely is recognize that you're not most likely, if you're watching this, you're not a member of the owning class. And if you are a member of the owning class who takes offense to what we say, because you're saying, well, I don't hurt people, I advise you to critically analyze that. And I will debate personally with any one of you who says that you're not part of the problem, because there's a very likelihood that if I could ask certain questions and probe certain ways, I could find out how you're connected to power. And the general gist of this is that power itself is the mechanism that created the wealth to begin with. The Fed is the source of the money, the mint and the Fed relationship. That centralization of financial power is the source of the money. But the source of the power to create that money is the power itself. And the power and the creation of that power are both self-feeding mechanisms. Money is not just like units of value, otherwise they couldn't change what it was. Money is permission slips to participate in their planned economy, and they can revoke your permission at any point. They can disconnect your bank account. They can shut down your social media. They can corner you in public with police. They can do anything they fucking want to you. And if you're, if you're in a suburban district, they can bomb your Black Wall Street or your Philly move if you try to be too significantly outside of it. If you're out like in the Branch Davidians or Ruby Ridge, they can bomb the shit out of you there too. And when they're not doing that, they're enabling it happening to people in Palestine, in Yemen, in Somalia, Sudan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, all of these places that they have exploited and expropriated. Many places in South America, Chile being a noted example of neoliberal influence. The class that you are a member of is the class that creates that oppression if you are part of that owning class. And if you are not a part of that owning class, you are one of the owned. And you need to recognize that, because the sooner you do, the sooner the chains that have been rattling around your neck that you've been told to ignore the sound of will become louder than ever, and the sooner you can rip them off your neck as a collected class and get the fuck up. Because right now they've got us pointing our barrels at each other. They create issues that we fight each other over. Like so much of the time has been spent trying to find ways to get us divided and fucked against each other, that we cannot rise up, because you can't point your barrel this way if it's pointed this way. You're horizontal pointing your barrel at members of your same class. You can't fight the people up here if you're fighting the people down here. You have limited energy and lives. So unless you understand the mechanisms, unless you understand the interplay and the complex way that this all weaves together, and unless you're willing to rise up against the whole entirety of the power structure, you're probably either a part of that power structure or one of the reasons that that power structure can, continue to exist. So we'll probably do another one on these, because my message to everybody out there is stop fighting their battles for them and start fighting your battle for you, for your soul, for the soul of you, your people, your nation, anything that you can get to ensure that they no longer have the power to own you and to own the means of production that control you and keep you isolated to narrow lanes of participation within society and culture and economy. And that's the only way that you will ever smash the fucking state.